Good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's lecture. My name is Dr. Sam Edwards, and it's my privilege to be one of the governors of the 2nd Air Division Memorial Trust. Before we get underway and before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of things I need to say. First up is the obligatory housekeeping message, and that is that we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm goes, it's the real deal. Make your way calmly to one of the exit points and follow the directions of Forum staff as they take you towards the muster point outside of the building. The second thing I need to say is just a brief word to make clear exactly how it is we're able to bring to you this afternoon's lecture. So this lecture, the annual Walker Lecture, is generously supported by the Walker family. Colonel Charles Chuck Walker was stationed in the UK with the 445th Bomb Group at the village of Tibbenham, Norfolk, during World War II. Colonel Walker piloted 35 bombing missions over Nazi Germany in the B-24 Liberator. After years of service, Colonel Walker became very active in keeping alive the memory and legacy of all those who had given their lives during the war. And as president of the 2nd Air Division Association and a governor of the 2nd Air Division Memorial Trust, Colonel Walker, well into his 90s, participated in events, travelling across the pond yearly to help all those remember the past and never forget the service of those we lost. I shall talk even louder then. Let me say now something about our speaker this afternoon. You can see some details about our speaker on the slide behind me there, but a few words of introduction here. So our speaker is Dr. John Curatola. Dr. Curatola is the Samuel Zemery Stone Senior Historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. A Marine Corps officer of 22 years, he holds master's degrees in both American and military history, with a doctorate from the University of Kansas. His research focuses upon World War II, air power, and the early Cold War period. Previously, Dr. Curatola taught history at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. His first two books, Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Tomorrow and Autumn of Our Discontent, assesses U.S. strategic air power capabilities in the early Cold War. His latest work, Armies Afloat, How the Development of U.S. Amphibious Forces Helped with World War II, addresses amphibious operations in the European theatre in the Second World War, and it's brought out by Kansas University Press. His additional works are available in various compendium works, popular magazines, websites, and academic journals, with his presentations available for viewing on the History Channel, on C-SPAN, on YouTube, news networks, and podcasts. And if you're hearing all of that and looking at the details about Dr. Curatola on the slide behind me, and the questions instantly coming to your mind is, why is it that an ex-Marine is talking about air power and writing about the Army? You can save that question for the Q&A that we'll have at the end of our talk. Dr. Curatola is going to talk to us for about 45 minutes or so, and at the end, there's going to be space, 15 minutes for your questions. So if you've got questions, make a mental note of them and save them for the end. Without further ado then, let me introduce Dr. Curatola, and let's all welcome him to the podium. Thank you, sir.
I'll spare you the suspense already. The reason why a Marine officer was studying the air power is because really I'm basically a frustrated P-51 pilot who was born 40 years too late. So that's how I transitioned into this field. All kidding aside, my godfather was a B-17 pilot with 15th Air Force and the proud son of a career Air Force meteorologist. So that's kind of my pedigree. So yeah, I joined the Marine Corps. There's a long story behind that. I'll spare you that one. But today I want to talk to you about what I think are really the unsung heroes of the combined bomber offensive. We all know about the air crewmen and their exploits, fighting the Germans and the elements at 20,000 feet. They're going to die of hypoxia, or they're going to freeze to death if their aircraft systems don't work, if engines fail. And the responsibilities for keeping those systems functioning and keeping those men alive in these rarefied air and in these dangerous environments fall to gentlemen that people don't really talk about. And those are the ground crewmen and the support personnel who made these air fleets possible. They're often overlooked because it's logistics, and it's not cool, it's not sexy, but it's important. And so let me start out by saying that the pilot and the airplane, the air crew are only the most visible element of air power. Airplanes are incredibly logistically heavy. Fuel farms, ammunition dumps. We had a wonderful discussion yesterday about Dr. Nunn about the building of airfields, the logistics that goes into that. What we don't talk about are the cooks, bakers, and the candlestick makers. for every one air crewman that's over the skies of occupied Germany during the Second World War, there are 20 American personnel on the ground supporting them. And that's what I kind of want to focus on today is, while the air crews certainly are worthy of our respect and worthy of our admiration, let's take a look at those men and women that actually allowed that to happen. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, just to give you some context, and I know this is a learned audience, but there are those people who don't understand what a squadron is or a bomb group is, so I'll kind of walk you through that a little bit. We'll talk about how these airfields are actually organized. Yesterday, Dr. Nunn talked about how they were built. Let's talk a little bit more about how they were organized, and how does that support an airfield and an air group in terms of doing its regular mission. So and then we'll get into, how do you fix these airplanes? What's the system that they instill to keep this large armada flying? And then lastly, I'll walk you through the anatomy of a mission, not a flying mission, but what the ground crews had to do to support these missions. So I'm not going to talk about the flying. I'm just going to talk about what the guys on the ground had to do every day when they were called upon to do those things. So first of all, if you look at the organization here, I know most of you people know this map better than I do, and if I mispronounce a name, I apologize. I'm an American. I know I get them wrong sometimes, so just bear with me on that one. Okay? But we look at all those airfields, and up to 400 or 200 are built just in a short span of a few years, thanks to not only American engineers, but also British contractors and the British people who are making their land available, providing their laborers to actually build these airfields. And what you see here, just under the Bomber Command piece on this, you have your individual squadrons, which is about 12 aircraft as a ballpark figure, and it ebbs and flows depending upon the year of the war. And when you have basically 4 squadrons, or 3 squadrons, depending what time of the year you have a bomb group. And usually at an individual air base is one bomb group. That's the genuine structure of these air bases. You have one bomb group with 3 or 4 squadrons at an individual base. Then, if you have 3 groups, that fits into a combat wing. Okay? And then when you have 4 or 5 combat wings, that fits into an air division. So you can see there's a hierarchy, there's a sequence. So when you hear bomb division or bomb wing or bomb group, these are different echelons of command. And of course, they all fall under 8th Bomber Command, which is all part of the 8th Air Force that had a fighter command, a ground air support command, and an air service command. So this slide, and there's one upstairs I know in the display, gives you an idea of how big this organization is. Not just in the air crew themselves for the bombers, but also the fighter guys, the cargo guys, and the logistics guys that support those organizations. So let's talk a little bit about airfield organization. Okay? In 1943, these airfields were run by about 500 personnel. As the war progresses, the number of support personnel that are assigned to a given base or location increases. By 1944, it's 700, and by the end of the war, it's 2,000 personnel who are working just on this base, keeping the base functioning itself. What you see here is a 1942 typical airfield, what they call a Class A airfield in 1943. And so they're all basically the same, but there's derivations based on where you're at. Generally, what you had was 3 airstrips, usually 60 degrees pointed in different directions. You had a main strip that was about 600 feet wide and about 6,000 feet long, and 2 subsidiary strips that were about 4,200 feet long. And of course, the main strip is pointing to the prevailing winds, so the aircraft obviously would take off into the headwinds and get the lift they need. But again, based upon the weather, you might need to use those secondary strips. So you'd have 3 strips that are about 60 degrees offset from any given direction. In addition to those runways, you also had what's called a perimeter track, where the planes could taxi from the hard stands to whatever runway they're using that day. And you can see it goes all the way around all 3 runways, so those gentlemen can taxi their aircraft to the duty runway for that mission. On top of that, you had the control tower, which was the only building that was allowed inside that perimeter track. In those control towers, and I know many of you live by them or have seen them, they're 2-story buildings. They're all basically the same configuration themselves. And next to those buildings, there was usually a Nissan hut, and the crash fire rescue personnel would be parked next to the control tower for that kind of a coordination with regard to emergencies themselves. Okay. Also, next to that tower, you would have a signal square that would identify the base. If you were flying over it, there'd be a code, and it had a couple of symbols in it, which we'll talk about a little bit later, so an aircrew flying over that didn't have radio communication could get some information about rules of the road, main runways, and the trafficability of that individual airfield. On top of that, you'd also have a number of hangars. 2 to 4 what they call Type 1 hangars. They're about 200 feet by around 115 feet, and they're big enough to fit in basically 3 B-17s. But they're constantly being occupied, so a lot of maintenance was done, of course, outside, not necessarily inside these hangars themselves, but there was accommodation for inside work into these aircraft, but again, usually it exceeded the capacity of what they had on the airfields themselves. Around the various hard stands, you had these aircraft dispersal huts. 1 for every 5 was the general rule. And this is where the crew chiefs and all the mechanics would service the aircraft, and it was a place for them to kind of go do their paperwork, get a break from the elements, as it were, and kind of unwind and do some of their paperwork instead of being out there in the exposed elements all the time. So those were dispersed throughout the parking aprons themselves. Now, on top of that, you have what's called the technical site. And this is where it really gets interesting, if you're a geek like me, okay? Here's where you have all the special purpose things. This is where you have your oil tanks for lubrication. This is where you have your training facilities, your link trainers to practice instrument flying. This is where you would have the building that housed the navigation trainer and the bombardier training, so they could keep their skills up while they weren't flying. This is also the place where you had life support, i.e. all the supply stuff, oxygen masks, helmets, parachutes, all the equipment that they would normally use. This is all being maintained in this technical site. It also had ordnance in there. That's where the armory would be in a lot of cases, because these guys are usually carried their .45. Where you got to secure those weapons. You just don't take them to your barracks at the end of the night. Those things have to be secured. And then ammunition has to be secured. So there would be armories there as well. Also, again, parachute storage areas. Those things require maintenance. They have to be unpacked and packed on a regular basis and inspected. So what you're seeing here is a lot of cats and dog maintenance. For example, who fixes the attitude indicator in your B-17 if it goes haywire, or your altitude or your altimeter is not working right? Pretty important instruments. They would have teams there that worked on nothing but instrumentation. There's also a place where they would put the Norden bomb sites in. And the one thing about the Norden room was, what I understand, it had humidity control and heating control, so it was a very popular place to be in England during the winter months because of the air conditioning accommodations there in the building itself. On top of that, you also had the headquarters site, where the operations center was, where the intel center was. It's also where the crew briefing rooms were. It's where the group commander set up his office, and all the supporting staff would be in this location here in the command, excuse me, in the headquarters site. Next, you had the communal sites. And this is where you have your cooks, your bakers, and your candlestick makers. This is where you have your mess halls, your PX. This is where you have your latrines, all those things that you need to keep a force healthy and fed. Barbers, all those kind of city functions, which is what these bases are. That's what you have here at these communal sites. This is where people lived on a daily basis. On top of that, you also had sick quarters. Obviously, people get sick. They have to go there and see the doc. It's also a mortuary, for obvious reasons. Usually around a 22-person bed, and as we heard from this morning, there's usually a local Army field hospital that would take the seriously wounded and treat them for long-term illnesses. But this is the initial stop after you unloaded, say, injured crewmen, be triaged, or with the temporary morgue, and then move them off for their remains to be given back to their families itself. On top of that, you also had the living sites. Usually had 10 to 25 Nissan huts, accommodating about 250 people in these locations. And this is where guys slept. This is where they unwound. And if you're a mechanic, you didn't see it very much. Why? Because you're out on the field a lot. I'll talk a little bit about that too. Again, why these guys are such unsung heroes given the work that they do. You also had the bomb dump. Obviously, you don't want that near anything that's really important because it might blow up. Usually it had about 50 tons of high explosives in there at any one given time. It could hold about 2,000 to 3,000 tons of explosives on a normal time. And it also had small arms ammunition for the 50 caliber machine guns that were in the B-17s, the flares, and all those kind of pyrotechnics that those aircraft might be using as well. And lastly, fuel storage. Now yesterday, Dr. Nunn talked about those fuel pipelines that were supporting these bases. Think about that for a second. You're going to launch, a wing or a group of B-17s, and that's going to require about 70,000 gallons of fuel for a group per mission. Per mission. So think about the logistics of trying to get fuel from these various pipelines, get it to a fuel farm, then you got to put it in a fuel bowser, then you got to drive it out to the airfields themselves. Okay? And so this was an incredibly logistics-heavy requirement to keep these aircraft full of fuel during these missions themselves. So when you look at the organization here of a combat wing, you had your commanding officer over here. Here's your headquarters, here's your bomb group and your squadrons. And over here you had your service group, and your service group has MPs in it, supply people in it, quartermaster, ordnance, maintenance, a whole list of functions under that wing commander. So this is just the guys who are flying, and these are the people who are providing support to those operational squadrons. They're keeping the base functioning. And for a wing commander here, just kind of build this out for you a little bit. Your commanding officer for station, okay? He has his air exec, who basically runs the unit, okay? But then he also has a ground exec who runs the base itself. We call the S4 functions in logistics terminology. And you can see all the cats and dogs that fall under a station in a 1943 structure itself. So again, when you think about a typical squadron, it's just this part. We don't talk much about this part of it. And to be honest with you, the relationships between the American airmen and our friends here in Great Britain, a lot of those relationships are the ground guys. One, there's more of them, okay? And two, they're here for years. I didn't rotate back after 25 missions. I'm here 1943, 1944. Oh, the war is over, now I get to go home. So a lot of these guys are here, ground people are not only more numerous, they're here for longer periods of time, as opposed to your air crewmen. So here's your general tower. This one, most of you have seen this one here at Thorpe Abbotts. It's a basic structure, and you see these throughout, and they're basically the same configuration throughout many of these bases themselves. Here's your signal square that talks about this particular base. T stands for Thorpe Abbotts, and those little symbols you see in that box all have meanings. So if you were flying over this place and didn't have radio communication, you can see that these signal squares have an abundance of information if you flew over, to give that air crew information about what it's like to land here, so to maintain this airfield. Some of them you could taxi off the runway and it wasn't a problem. Sometimes, no, don't taxi off the hard stand. Remember, a lot of airfields just grass strips. And so airfields had different rules and regulations for rules of the road. Some places had just land here in emergency. Nope, don't land here at all. Traffic patterns. So these bases these signal squares in these bases would give you a lot of information that you could use as you were flying over. So that kind of gives us the basis of the units themselves and the bases that they operated from. Let's talk about maintenance. Yeah, yawner, I get it. Maintenance isn't fun. But they had a 4-tier echelon system in the 8th Air Force during this time. And the first echelon was basically the daily checks, light maintenance, tightening of screws, fasteners, bolts, replacing little light bulbs, those kinds of things that the crew or the crew chief could do on a regular or daily basis. They're called first echelon. The second echelon is where you have the routine servicing and preventative maintenance, swapping out spark plugs, maybe changing out some oil, replacing an instrument here or there. And that was basically repairs that took less than 36 hours. That was the determination for second echelon. For third echelon, anything greater than 36 hours. And that was usually done by a depot of some kind, salvage, removal of major components, like you're going to take the tail assembly off, or you're going to rewire the aircraft, or those kinds of things. That's going to take much longer than 36 hours, so that would be elevated to what we call third echelon. And finally, you'd have fourth echelon, or depot level, where you had major overhaul of airframes, complete rebuild of an aircraft. Maybe it reached its X amount of service life in terms of flight hours. You take that thing to a depot level, they'll strip it down to its basic structure, rebuild it, and then put it back out again. So these depots are important in terms of keeping the fleet of aircraft afloat when they need major repairs. Okay? So when we talk about maintenance facilities, and here I got some quotes from you, from some of these gentlemen. Sergeant Leroy says, all the time we were outdoors, never inside. We were outside, and I don't know why that arrow's still up there, but at any rate. We were outside in 2 pyramid tents by the hard stand area we set up as a temporary home. Remember, as I mentioned, these guys aren't in those barracks a lot. They're living out here in the field making things happen. We lived and slept there during busy times when there wasn't time to return to our billets and mess halls. One time we worked 2 days and nights. Catching up on sleep was important then. So again, think about what these gentlemen are going through on a regular basis in their daily life just to keep these aircraft in the air. Now, in terms of their structure within a squadron itself, okay, in the first echelon, each squadron had 3 flights of about 4 aircraft each for a total of 12 aircraft. We talked about that before. Okay? Then within each squadron, you had a line chief. And he's basically in charge of all those ground crew chiefs and their crewmen that are part and parcel of that ground crew. And with him, he had some specialized personnel with him, a prop mech, a sheet metal guy, an electrical tech, and then he had an admin clerk. Why an admin clerk? For those of you who have worked in aviation, everything is documented. Everything is documented. Why? Because if a plane crashes, you got to, was it maintenance? Was it combat? We do that today. So again, an admin clerk to write down the findings and repairs and those kinds of things. You had 3 flight chiefs, obviously with each flight, and then you had, underneath him, you had 4 crew chiefs with 3 mechanics and an armorer. And you notice they serviced their plane. You know, we see plenty of pictures of the air crew standing in front of the nose art, and this is our plane. No, they just fly the darn thing, okay? The ground crew, it's their plane. They own it. And if you go upstairs, I noticed in our display up there, they have a story on that B-24 Witchcraft that I think was flew 130 missions without any maintenance problems. And the ground crew was like, unless you have all 3 or 4 engines out, don't ditch that aircraft. It comes back. You know, because they had such pride in that aircraft and the fact that it was aloft for so many missions. These guys really took pride in these airplanes themselves. Within the squadron itself, look at this. This is what you had in each individual squadron at that second echelon. 48 aircraft and engine mechs. Then you had 2 aircraft inspectors because after the guy finished the work, you got to have somebody come and inspect the work to make sure that it's up to snuff. Then you had electrical, instrument, propeller, sheet metal workers, welder, drivers, carpenters, motor T mechs, because we have a lot of trucks, right? Well, who's fixing the truck engines? Well, got to have motor T guys fixing Ford, deuce and a half trucks. So again, you start, going down into the details. There's a lot of equipment on the base, not only the trucks, but also the fuel bowsers and the tractors that are moving the trailers around with the bombs on them. Somebody's got to fix those things too. They don't fix themselves. And so you can see this large amount of guys at the squadron level who are just mechanics. Here's one of those standard T1 hangars that's still standing there at Parno. I'm sure many of you have been there. It's in great shape. They must take really good care of that thing to be standing all those years and is looking as good as it does. Now, then that third and fourth echelon, generally stationed around 2 airfields. They could service 2 groups at the same time. Generally, not always. The fourth echelon fell under the 8th Air Force Support Command, had 3 locations at Lanford, Wharton, and Burtonwood. And this is where they did that major overhaul of airframes if they had major damage or they need to be overhauled themselves. They also played a significant role when we left. We all went home. What do you do with all these birds? You can't fly them all home. Some have to be salvaged. And how do you get rid of these airframes? And so they were part and parcel of that demobilization piece that the United States and yourselves had to do after the war. We had all these great airplanes. What do you do with them now? And so these depots were instrumental in getting those aircraft back home or disposing with them altogether. Most of you are probably familiar with an Air Force cartoonist study by Bob Stevens, and this is his discussion on combat in the 8th Air Force, saying, well, look at this way, we'll have a hell of a story to make when we tell people at future reunions, as they're flying home with the damage on the aircraft, of which that ground crew will be fixing shortly. And according to one crew chief, we watched the planes take off on each mission and waited patiently when they came back. In the early days, and we had many days, when planes of our group did not return. These were days of sadness and sorrow for having lost close friends, and we would have to unwind later at the pub. These guys had relationships with those flight crews. They owned the airplane, it's their airplane, but those are also their friends in these airplanes. And of course, they don't come back. They felt it just as well as other family members would feel a loss of a loved one. So it's important to remember that. Let's talk about maintenance of, say, a B-24 in this case, okay? It had a regularly scheduled program to look at this airframe to make sure that it is airworthy. You had a pre-flight inspection that was done by the crew chief himself. This is before the crew even shows up that morning. The crew chief and his 3 or 4 ground crewmen would actually do checks, engine run-ups before the air crew showed up. So they do a pre-flight, they do a warm-up, and then they had daily inspections they had to do. Then after 25 flight hours, you had about 100 man hours means how much work went into this 25-hour inspection. To say, look at the engines, pull certain components, inspect them, make sure they're still functioning capacity, at proper capacity. Then you had a 50-hour inspection and a 100-hour inspection. Now, think about a mission is about 6 to 8 hours, ballpark figure. If these things are flying, 2 or 3 times a week, or at very busy times more than that, those numbers can rack up really quickly. So think about the requirement to not only do these inspections, but keep up with it and have enough manpower to do a 100-hour man-hour inspection for a 25-hour inspection, or 400 man-hours for a 100-hour inspection. So you can see that workload is increasing exponentially over the course of time. As I mentioned before, you got to document everything. Document everything. And the Army Air Corps had what's called TA Manual 415, which basically was a 100-page document that said, hey, these are the things that all airplanes should be inspected for. It was very generic. It basically said you got to check the instrumentation, the engines, the fuel systems, the oxygen systems. It kind of laid out the framework for what you should be doing in terms of keeping these aircraft airborne. But then on top of that, you had what's called Form 41B, Maintenance Inspection Record. This was the history of that airplane in detail. Every repair, every piece of damage that hit that, or damage that it had, every action taken on that aircraft, and it was a complete record of that aircraft's life. Then, on top of that, for each mission, you had Form 1A, the Airplane Flight Report. And what this was after the crew chief did his pre-flight inspection and his pre-flight warm-ups, he would fill this form out regarding the engine performance, RPM, oil temperature, those kinds of things, and he would give it to the pilot in command and say, I'm giving you an airworthy airplane. And here's the documentation to support that. The pilot then would take that document and he would keep it on his person. Then when they landed, he would fill out the performance of that aircraft, any problems with that aircraft, to document that. The left navigation light's out, and the third engine, RPM is running a little bit high. He would document those things, give them back to the crew chief, and that was basically the gripe list for what would need to be fixed on that aircraft before the next mission. So if you look here, here's your TM 415, your aircraft inspection guide, and here you see your Form 1A. Up top you see the inspection status. Here you have the engine run-up numbers and what they saw, what they were in the tanks. And then here you see gripes and problems. Here you can see the flight time record, how much time an engine had on it, how much time an airframe had on it. All these things are documented. And again, remember those ground crewmen? Sleep was where you could get it. So let's talk about the anatomy of a ground mission, not the aircrew mission, but the ground mission. So these gentlemen are, let's assume they're in their Nissen huts for once, okay, as opposed to sleeping out in the tent, okay? And they're woke around 5 in the morning, and they're told, hey, we're going to have a mission. And then what would happen is they would go to their aircraft, and the armament officer of the group, of the squadron, would tell them, here's what we're carrying today, 500-pound HE, or incendiaries, or whatever the case may be. They would get notification of what the bomb load was for that day. Then the crew chiefs would bring what they called the putt-putt, this little generator you see right here. Because to load the bombs up and to test the instruments and to test the lighting, you got to have a power source. Well, most of those power sources, when the aircraft is operated off an engine. There's no reason to start a whole engine just to do those kind of checks. So what they did is you brought in this thing called the putt-putt that provided electrical power to the aircraft to turn on those systems so they could load the bombs up, check the instrumentation, and to make sure the electrical system was in good functioning order. Then they would, of course, remove the tarps and the canvas off the aircraft, especially if it was frosty, because you can't have frost on wings when you take them off, especially in the wintertime. The ammunition truck would arrive with not just the bombs, but also keep in mind all those 50 caliber machine guns that they had bristling on B-17s and B-24s. Yeah, about 5,000 rounds to load into that aircraft. And you got to put the guns in there. Sometimes the crews would do that themselves. Usually the pilot, the navigator and the bombardier would do it themselves. And the waist gunners would load them in by themselves. But again, you'd help these guys out, put these 50 caliber machine guns in their places, because you just don't stick them out there and leave them there. They have to be dismounted, put it into an armory where the guns are also serviced. You got to have armorers to service those guns on top of that. Okay? Then the bomb cart would arrive, and you'd have to assemble the bombs together while they were there. So what you'd have is the basic body itself. They'd have to put the fuses in, put the fins in, and then the tail fuse in there, and then, of course, the arming wire on top of that. So this is all being done before the crews have even shown up. This is going to take about an hour or so to build the bombs and then to load them up into the bomb bay itself. Then, again, the crew hasn't shown up yet. These are all radial engines. And those of you familiar with radial engines, what tends to happen is when they're sitting idle, all that oil and stuff tends to flow down into those lower cylinders. And it can be a fire hazard, and it can also prevent the cylinder from lighting off when you want it to ignite. So what the crews had to do was they had what they call pull the props. What they did was they stood underneath each one of those props in a line, like 3 or 4 guys in a line. And what they would do is they would push the prop forward. Next guy would come and push the next prop forward. They would rotate the propellers 3 times. The reason for that is for the valves in there to unload any oil that might have accumulated in those lower cylinders. It's called pulling the props. So they had to kind of prime the engines. I'll use that word. That's not what it is. But they had to kind of prime the engines to get that pooled oil and fuel out of those lower cylinders. Then the crew chief would go into the cockpit and start up those engines to do those pre-flight warm-ups that I talked about. He would play with the throttles, check the RPMs, check the engine temperatures. And he'd run them for about 15 to 30 minutes just to kind of get the planes up to operating temperature, and then document what he's finding on that Form 1A. And that, again, that's what he's going to give to the pilot. Okay? Then, of course, the 50 caliber guns, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, will arrive, and they'll install them too with the help of the armorers. As I mentioned, the Form 1A is filled out, given to the aircraft commander. Then, the truck shows up with flak jackets and helmets, because remember, they're going to get shot at by 88 millimeters from the ground, 20 millimeters from German fighters, and so a lot of times they would wear these flak jackets. Not going to protect you from an 88 millimeter, but a protective piece of flak flies into that fuselage and grazes you across the chest. So they would show up after the armorers would show up. Then, of course, you got the fuel bowers that got to show up to put fuel in the airplane itself. And as I said, a 17 holds about 1,700 gallons, 100 octane fuel. So these fuel bowsers are constantly moving, going from plane to plane over time. And of course, you have an oxygen system. And these oxygen bottles have to be filled and serviced and make sure that that oxygen system is working, because again, at 20,000 feet, if the oxygen system fails, you're going to pass out of hypoxia in a short span of about 2 to 3 minutes. So this is also a very important function. Okay. The Norden bomb sight football would arrive. Now remember, the Norden's in two pieces, folks. It's not one thing. Okay? There's the football, as they refer to it, American football, not British football, on top of this thing. And that's the brains of the Norden that the bombardier would use to line up and time and drop the ordnance, sometimes accurately, mostly not. But at any rate, well, that's a whole other story. But in the bottom of that was where the bezels and the cranks were that actually control the airplane itself. So when they're on the bombing run, the pilot would give command to the bombardier. He would set the sight. And then what would happen is the sight would control the aircraft on the bombing run as it sat on top of those bezels and connection to the flight controls. So in the bombing run, usually the bombardier and the Norden bomb sight was in control of the aircraft. And of course, as time goes on, accuracy, who needs it? Okay, that's a whole other story. But the bomb sight would show up again, and again, the pilot would get to Forum 1A. Then the crew would start going through its various pre-flight checklists to start the aircraft up. At the appropriate time, after the crews were briefed on when the takeoff time was and the sequence was, green flares would be, hey, start your engines. They would slowly taxi to that proper runway via those taxiways or that I showed you there earlier. The green light starts the takeoff sequence. You can see these little drive-in vans. Because remember, the tower is at one location, but they have 3 different runways. And somebody's got to be there to kind of control what's going on with that traffic as it gets on the runway. So these little portable vans that they would drive to the end of the runway and they flash the green light, you take off. Usually about 15, 20-second intervals, they would take off. You can see what's funny is in these little drive vans, that's a top turret to a B-17 that they decided, hey, we'll put it on top and you can see better. Some of them are the nose turrets. That's really kind of funny what they did with these things. And of course, here's one of the, it's a B-17 nose right there. And again, rotate around 110, 120 knots. So the mission is underway. And if you're a ground crewman, there you go. Now's your time to sleep. And that's when the guys finally got some rest and that they well deserved. Mission goes on anywhere, 4, 6, 8 hours, depending on the mission itself. And of course, the crews have to come back and sequence entire bomb group onto a given airfield. But there's some special rules there. Aircraft with casualties have the priority. Fire 2 flares if you got casualties on board. Other aircraft get out of the way so you can land first. And here you see what the crews refer to as a meat wagon. Wounded were unloaded at the nearest hard stand with the ambulance coming in behind them for obvious reasons. Okay? Upon shutdown, all the gear on the guns are removed. Forum 1A is completed. Pilot's going to write out here, engine number 2 was not running smoothly, the oil system back didn't work, or whatever the case may be. And he would give that to the crew chief. And then the ground crew, folks, has to do post-flight inspections. Because where's the air crew going? Debrief. They're debriefing it. So the ground crew is stuck doing post-flight inspections and, oh, by the way, getting ready for the next mission. Okay, on top of that. And doing any corrective or preventive maintenance. Again, maybe the engine wasn't working right or the fuel system didn't work right. And to that extent, as always, you would start maintenance immediately upon the ship's return. There was always plenty of normal maintenance to take care of. But when you consider that in addition, there was always battle damage. There wasn't a lot of time to get in the ship in shape for a mission the following morning. The last thing we did before quitting for the evening, which many times was only a few hours before briefing the next mission, was to pre-flight the ship. So again, many of these guys are working through the night to get these planes ready for the next mission. And this job can get even harder. The crew put a cover over the dead pilot. In the cockpit, there was blood and pieces from the pilot over the dash of the plane. After the medics and the air crew left, we went and scrubbed down the instrument panel with alcohol and gauze. My friend's blood had oozed down between the instrument panels and was difficult to get out, but we did. In a case like this, you just put your mind on hold and scrub as hard as you could. Personal connections to these men. And as we talked about a little bit yesterday, what happens to the human body in combat is often horrific. And these crew chiefs are usually the the first responders to clean up those messes. And again, it's a testament to their professionalism that they did this duty for their comrades in arms. On a lighter note, okay, I brought you down, I know I did that. On a lighter note, I think this is a great example of the life of a ground crewman. Our fearless pilot comes back and he stays up all night fixing and oiling and getting the aircraft ready, and 3 hours later, he's right back at ground zero again where he laid off just a few minutes ago. Okay, I am right on time, and for that, I will open the floor for any questions you may have.
Let's just thank him first.
Oh.
But as the man said, floor is open to questions.
Yeah, please.
Raise your hand and,
Yeah. Yes, sir.
My brother had a Norden bomb sight on his Lancaster.
Mm.
Now, was that a British invention or American?
That's a great question. Actually, the Norden was a U.S. Navy invention. Oh my God, the Navy, kidding me? Because the Navy was really interested in bombing battleships. And what happens is Mr. Norden is kind of an irascible figure. He's hard to work with. And he has a fallout with the Navy. He takes it to the Air Force. Hey, this is a great thing. And so the Air Force buys this Navy-produced bomb sight. Now, for the Brits to be using it, I'm sure that they did. But it's interesting because the British doctrine is different from the American doctrine, as you know. The British are doing area bombardment, and the Americans are going, we're going to do this daily precision stuff. And the Brits are like, we tried that, it doesn't work real well, but go ahead and try it anyway. But why it was on a British, that's interesting. I can't answer why it would be on a Lanc. But it was because you'd also have the mechanism on the bottom that controls the flight controls as well. You know, so I can't speak to why that would be on a Lanc. What's that, ma'am?
They did have Northern bombs.
On the long, yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it might have been, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I think they had them all towards the end when they realised that they were a good thing.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's the Norden and bombing briefs really well, especially for flying over the clear skies of Southern California where the temperature is 80 degrees and nobody's shooting at you. Okay. Matter of fact, there's a great letter from Fred Anderson, who was one of the first general officers to fly combat with the 8th Air Force. And he writes a letter to Kurt LeMay, and he says, life's a lot different when the enemy is shooting at you and there are swarms of pursuits around. You know, to kind of, it briefs real well, but real combat over Germany with the Luftwaffe, it's a very different existence. Yes, ma'am.
So also about the Norden bomb site, I'm trying to figure out what it means to have the bomb site take over the aircraft and what, so my dad was
a bombardier
pilot,
yeah.
Right? What actually happens? Is it a manual? Is it a
Yeah, what it is the brains are up here, and then there's mechanical linkages that it sits upon, which is part of the bomb site, and those are connected to the flight controls. It's called the Automatic Flight Control Equipment, AFCE, is how they refer to it. And so once you lined up the Norden bomb site, and don't ask me how to line up, because I've read the manual, I still don't know how to do it, okay? But what it would do is it would feed that input down to those gears, and then it would control the flight of the aircraft. Now, sometimes the plane would drift off and right, and they actually had an instrument called a PDI that would show you that it was starting to drift off of the planned intended flight. But there was mechanical linkages down there that went to the flight controls themselves that flew them straight and level. As the war first started, of course, American air crews are flying into these flak fields, and they're like, oh, we got to get out of the way. Well, it's when the commander of the 305th Bomb Group, a guy by the name of Curtis LeMay, says, we're going to hit the IP, and you're going to fly straight and level, and there's no deviation from that. And the air crews are like, you're going to get us killed, this is suicide. And he says, no, it's not. You know why? Because I'm going to be in the first airplane, and I'm doing it. And that became standard practice for the 8th Air Force for the rest of the war. Now, later on, as the threat from the Luftwaffe kind of goes down, what they would do is they would have the lead plane in a group or squadron have an actual bombardier in it. And the rest of them, they just have what they call togglers. Yeah, he would just sit there and go, oh, he dropped his, okay, and hit the switch, and all the bombs would drop at the same time. Not actually, looking at the site, he was just looking for the lead bombardier to drop his bombs. It's called the bomb togglers. So, yes, in the back, yes, sir.
Thank you. If flying a ship couldn't be got ready in time for the next mission, would the ground crew have another plane
We usually, yeah. No, that's not how it works. No, usually what you had is supernumeraries. What happened is when they would schedule a mission, you would launch more aircraft than were actually planned for a strike. And then if none of the planes dropped out, 2 or 3 of those planes would just go back home as extra. So they would always launch more than what they needed in case you had, because even if you took off, oh, now my engine number 1 is coughing up, whatever, and it's not going to make it all the way to the mission. You have to turn around and go back, and you'd have one of those spare aircraft come up. So there are always 2 or 3 spare aircraft per group or per squadron for a given mission. Does that answer your question, sir?
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Who performed the toddler position? It's my understanding that the bombardiers kind of weeded out, and then they became navigators in case of doubt. So who was pulling that?
Yeah, a lot of times there are they call that the ground people are called paddle feet. Sometimes that's the way they can get themselves in a mission, because all I got to do, it doesn't take any skill, to pull that thing. A lot of times the ground crewmen would get a bonus ride if they want to fly combat, obviously.
I never saw them on the load list.
No, it's just a term that they use in theater without having someone like your dad, a trained navigator or bombardier, use somebody who just all they do is pull the switch. And so it didn't necessarily require training. Now, over the course of time, one of the things that the 8th Air Force does is they establish lead crew schools. For example, you'd have a crew, and their primary mission was to study Ludwigshafen. Let's just say that's the mission. And what they would study everything about Ludwigshafen, the city composition, the road networks, the rail networks. And so when a group or squadron was going to Ludwigshafen, they were the lead crew because they had experience, they had studied the target, and you had these schools created called lead crew schools to teach these guys how to do analysis of these specific targets, to be the duty experts on that. And so those guys would be in those lead aircraft as part of lead crew schools. Yes, sir, in the back. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you go first, and then we've got one from someone that's watching in across the pond. But yeah, you go first.
Yes, sir.
Second echelon maintenance, which is ground crew, reported to the base commander. But the third echelon, the recovery guys, they would be, if they were on an airfield, even if they shared airfields, they would be working with the ground crews doing stuff. But who did they didn't report to?
No, they belong to the support command. Because you have the group commander, and he owns the squadrons and that first and second echelon maintenance. That third echelon would belong to that Air Force Support Command, which is a whole nother organization outside of that group. Does that make sense to you, sir? Got it.
Yes, so we've got a question here, John, from Christine, who's watching over in Washington, D.C. Christine asks, at this point, did the base have to worry as well about attacks?
Great
German
question.
intrusion? Yeah.
I'm going to ask the audience. No, we know that by 43, 44, that's generally not a threat anymore. Of course, every now and then you'd have a V1 or a V2, of course, later on in the war. But after the Blitz, after 41, the threats of the bases themselves kind of evaporates over time. Every now and then there's the errant, mission that came this way, but by and large, no. And to that point too, I'd like to bring out that in my study of airfields, and Steve jump in here, what amazed me was there's no perimeter fence. These guys were working on these aircraft, and there's a farm girl there with her plow or with her, hey, how are you? Good to see you, kind of thing. It wasn't like security, like today, you can't walk on an airbase without, going through the front gate. But you didn't have that problem here. And I think it speaks to the relationship between those local communities and these airmen. We mentioned this yesterday, but in the Memphis Belle movie, there's the one scene where they're waiting for the mission, they're stalled, and the farmer's walking by with his, wheat machine, whatever it was. And the guy goes, hey, I know how to fix that. And he jumps over there and helps the farmer, till his field. Which, again, it's probably apocryphal, but it's probably indicative of that relationship between those local communities and the men who were working on those aircraft on a regular basis.
We've got a couple of minutes left if there are any other questions. Yes, at the back.
In the back, yes, sir.
Is there any collaboration between US ground crews, RAF?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know. You stumped the chump. Good on you there. I would, because what you really see, you had Bomber Command, you had U.S. Air Force, Strategic Air Forces, kind of doing their own thing. Regarding tactics, techniques, and procedures, I can't imagine, because the two airframes are so different, you know, lengths and, you know, Halifax as opposed to B-17s and B-24s. It doesn't mean that they didn't. I'm just not aware if they did. It's a good question. I just don't have an answer for you. Sorry, I apologize.
Any other questions?
Yeah, in the back.
Yes, go for it.
What dictates the decision-making on ABDR or hard landings for moving from second echelon to third and fourth?
Oh, okay. Yeah, who made? Usually the crew chief. You know.
I can't fix this.
Yeah, and you usually had, because everything's documented, they would have man hours, you know, assigned to individual tasks. This takes X amount of hours to change out an engine, for example. And so based upon that template, things would move on to second or third echelon. Now, I will tell you, in my own experiences in the military, this should go to third echelon. Hey, Skipper, we got this. You know, there were times where let's not do that. Because here's the problem you have when you send something to third or fourth echelon. You lost it. And as somebody asked me about who owns that organization, well, I don't own that organization. And what are their priorities? So that might be 17 or B-24, which is a priority, which went to third or fourth echelon. May not be third or fourth echelon's priority. It is mine, but I don't own those mechanics. And so a lot of times you're loath to send it up to higher echelon because you might not be getting it back as fast as you want. Okay? So that's where a lot of times you're like, Skipper, I got it. I can change this engine now or do what I need to at a lower echelon. Illegal, but we can. But it's wartime, so things gotta happen. So.
John, can I ask one? Because we've got a couple of minutes. Yeah, I think I can probably guess the answer here, but I'm just curious. Given the specialist skills that these guys need, do you get a sense that the Army Air Corps are deliberately, purposely trying to recruit mechanics from civilian life, people that have that skill set already, or are they just because it's a big get who we can get and then we'll train them?
That's a great question, and it's bigger than just the Air Corps. All the services have this issue. We want people who have an aptitude, who maybe he works on outboard engines, for crying out loud, or something like that. They're trying to actively recruit those people with those skill sets, but the requirements that they need for mechanics and air crews and all that stuff, it's so large that after a while, look, we need everybody we can. They do look for those aptitudes, and of course, you get drafted, or if you volunteer, you got to take an aptitude test to see, this is a square, and this is a circle, and this is a hammer, and that kind of helps drive what skill set you're going to go to if you're going to be a mechanic or a typist and those kinds of things. So they are looking for those people, but the demand is so great. Because think about this, not only do we have the 8th Air Force here, you got the 9th Air Force, which is doing ground support. You got the 12th Air Force in the Mediterranean, the 15th Air Force, also in the Mediterranean. Oh, and by the way, in the Pacific, the 7th, the 20th, the 14th, the 15th Air Force. You have, basically 16 numbered Air Forces throughout the world that we're trying to keep afloat on 2 different theaters. So yes, but we'll take what we can get.
Oh, we've got one in the back. Another question in the back.
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Yep. Or, ma'am, I'm sorry.
My question is about the checklist. So there was pre-flight checklist, there was mechanics, and then there was flight checklist.
Yes, ma'am.
Co-pilot, pilots, etc. A question, and then actually those checklists made it into civil aviation.
Yes.
And following that, much later into surgery checklist, hospital quality assurance. What I'm wondering about is who developed those? How did they coordinate them? Who refined them?
Yeah.
And how did that system all come together? Because that was absolutely critical.
Yeah, that's a great question. Many of those checklists are produced by the manufacturer, Lockheed, Boeing, through the process of building, designing, and test flying that aircraft. So they would create these checklists, and then what you would have is the Army Air Corps would, of course, coordinate with the manufacturer on best practices, and then units themselves would come up with their checklist. Now, to your point, do they follow it all the time? No. Keep in mind, during the Second World War, these are low-time pilots in high-performance aircraft. Okay, these are 19, 20, 21-year-old kids. They maybe have 200 hours underneath them. Now they're flying a complex aircraft in a combat environment, and so were procedures always followed? No. And there's a lot of accidents. We talked about accidents the other day. There's a huge number, like one a day here in East Anglia, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. You know, and so the checklists are, of course, built by the manufacturer and approved by the Army Air Corps, and then submitted down to the individual units and squadrons themselves. And sometimes they would morph them based upon the environment where they're at. Like it says, you know, turn on your oil heater. Well, I'm in Africa. I don't need to turn on the oil heater. It's already hot here, kind of thing. You know, so they would adjust them based upon the theaters themselves. However, where I'm taking this to is after the war, and to your point, ma'am, is checklist and standardization of procedures gets to be law in aviation, especially in the 50s, both in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, and I'm sure in the Royal Air Force. Why? Because planes are more expensive. Pilots take a lot more time to train, and we can't afford to lose these guys. And so checklists become writ. You will follow that now. And even in today's modern Air Force, if there's a crash, they're going to ask the pilot, okay, did you follow the checklist with regard to a flame out? And they're going to go through all those steps, and they can tell whether you did or if you didn't. So standardization becomes a priority subsequent to the war. And they try to establish it here during the war, but again, it's kind of loosely enforced depending upon the command that you're in and the nature of the pilot itself. But they evolve over time to the point that you made, ma'am, that they are now writ, and you do not deviate from those checklists. Is that your question, ma'am?
Yes, thank you.
So
Go for it.
what's your impression of the League of Nations ground crew that was for the famous champion bomber of the age, Witchcraft, Joe Ramirez, George Jong, and George Vetter, Walter Elliott,
Yeah.
and then, you know, I know you probably know them real well. Tell us your impressions and why were they so successful?
Well, first of all, they're very competent mechanics and dedicated to their mission and to the aircrewmen themselves. So first of all, that comes off the top. Okay. In my experience, you know, in the military, and those of you who've worked a fleet of whether vehicles or airplanes or boats, whatever the case may be, there are some designs, there are some aircraft that just work real well. And there are some, this thing's a lemon. We've all had cars like that. Think about this, you know, we've all had really great cars that lasted for years, and we had some that, why'd I buy this damn thing? Okay? And I think Witchcraft is one of those aircraft that a dedicated aircrew, professional in the duties, but they got a really good airplane that was well built, that for whatever reason, the gremlins stayed away. You know, and of course, you see that, you know, in some of the nose art with gremlins and stuff like that, because they knew that a lot of stuff goes wrong on these aircraft. You know, and so when you look at like fleet management, these things kind of come to play in that, hey, I have 20 airplanes, but this one's always the hangar queen. It's always got a fuel problem or a pressurization problem. You know, we've heard those terms a lot. And so I think Witchcraft is the direct opposite of that. And that's my assessment on it, sir, for good or well.
I think we're just about out of time, folks. So can we thank Dr. Curatola again once for a fantastic talk?